You know, usually when we hear a buzzword repeated over and over on the news, it is just incredibly easy to spot the underlying agenda.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like when a CEO gets on one of those quarterly earnings calls and starts talking about, streamlining operations or finding strategic
Sure, you don't
synergies.
need a business degree to know what that means.
Exactly. You know that someone, somewhere, is about to get fired. I mean, the corporate speak is just a very thin veneer over a pretty harsh reality.
It's like a defense mechanism built right into the language itself.
Hmm.
We all learn to translate that subtext over time. You just stop hearing the actual words and you start hearing the structural intent behind them.
Yes, that is the perfect way to put it, actually. Listening for the structural intent.
Yeah.
But lately, there is this one phrase floating around everywhere that sounds completely unassailable. Like, you really cannot escape it.
I think I know the one you mean.
Yeah, you hear politicians across the entire political spectrum pleading for it. You have economists writing these complex fiscal policies around it. And even, like, local city councils are plastering it all over their mission statements.
Right.
And that phrase is social cohesion.
Ah, yes. The big one.
Right. On its face, it sounds like a warm societal hug. It just sounds flawless.
It does. It evokes this idyllic, almost utopian picture. Like we hear social cohesion and we immediately picture neighbors helping neighbors, you know?
Yeah, a totally harmonious, friction-free community.
Exactly, where everyone just instinctively understands each other and works toward a common good. It's a very seductive concept.
It is. But I want to push past that idyllic picture today. Because when we actually look under the hood of this buzzword, a very different, much more complex mechanism emerges. And that is what we are digging into in this deep dive.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, so I have been going through just a massive amount of literature on this. Everything from sociological data tracking public behavior in Poland during the COVID-19 pandemic to behavioral economics papers analyzing why people pay taxes in India.
Wow, that's a wide range.
It really is. And we're even looking at some recent parliamentary debates in Australia regarding civil liberties. And synthesizing all of this leads to a very specific and honestly somewhat uncomfortable question.
Which is?
When governments ask for or expect an increase in social cohesion, are they actually just asking for an increase in social compliance?
Oh, yeah, that distinction right there, that is the entire ballgame.
Right.
I mean, the line between a community that organically holds itself together through mutual trust and a population that simply obeys the rules out of habit or algorithmic nudging or fear, that line is incredibly thin.
It seems like modern states often blur that line intentionally.
They absolutely do. As they grow more complex, it becomes a feature, not a bug.
Right. And before we get into the really granular examples, especially when we touch on some highly polarizing political protests later on, I do want to frame how we are approaching this for you listening.
Yeah, that's important context.
We are looking at this purely as an engineering problem. We are just mapping the mechanics of how society functions. Our goal today is absolutely not to take a political stance or argue the moral high ground of any particular policy.
Right, we're just looking at the data.
Exactly. We're here to impartially report on the ideas contained in these texts to understand how the language of cohesion is deployed by different actors. We're just looking at the gears turning underneath the political rhetoric.
We are dissecting the machinery of the state and the psychology of the citizen, nothing more, nothing less.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where does this term social cohesion actually come from? Because, I mean, it certainly didn't just appear out of nowhere in a modern press briefing.
No, definitely not. It has deep roots.
Yeah, I was reading up on the sociological roots of this, and it seems to trace all the way back to the late 19th century, specifically to the French sociologist Émile Durkheim.
Right, Durkheim, a foundational figure.
And his environment completely dictated his philosophy, because he was writing during the explosive peak of the Industrial Revolution, just watching society undergo this massive, unprecedented upheaval.
Durkheim was essentially watching the old world burn down and a new world being built right on top of it. He was obsessed with one core, terrifying question.
Which was how society maintains order.
Exactly. How does a society maintain any semblance of order when the foundational structures of daily life are just changing so rapidly?
Before industrialization, order was baked right into the geography. Society was smaller, vastly more rural, you lived in a village, you did what your parents did, and literally everyone knew everyone else's business.
Right, Durkheim called that mechanical solidarity. It was a cohesion based on sheer similarity.
Mechanical solidarity, okay.
Yeah. In a state of mechanical solidarity, cohesion is almost automatic. People share the same daily experiences, the same religion, the same narrow worldview. But then, industrialization forced millions of people into massive, crowded, anonymous cities.
Right, it totally scrambled the board.
Exactly. It introduced a radical division of labor. Suddenly, people became highly specialized.
And Durkheim argued that this extreme specialization forced a brand new kind of societal glue, right, which he called organic solidarity.
Yes. He theorized that modern cohesion isn't something that can be artificially imposed. Like, it can't be preordained by a king or a church. It has to develop spontaneously out of pure necessity.
Because we're also specialized?
Right. Because we're all specialized in an industrial economy, we literally cannot survive without each other. The baker needs the blacksmith to fix the oven. The blacksmith needs the farmer for food. The farmer needs the banker for a loan.
That makes total sense. It's this dense web of mutual dependence that just forces people to develop cooperative relationships.
Exactly. You build trust because you have no other choice. It is forged in just a myriad of daily mundane interactions.
So it's not some top-down decree.
No, and that organic solidarity creates a resilient society. It is not fragile. It's built on the actual material reality that we need each other to get by.
Okay, so in its original, pure Durkheimian form, social cohesion is a natural byproduct of human interdependence. But when you look at modern public policy literature, it seems like governments have taken this natural phenomenon and attempted to institutionalize it.
They absolutely have.
Yeah, the sources we are looking at point out that modern policy generally splits this concept into two very different operational directions, the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach.
And the contrast between those two approaches tells you everything about how a specific government views its citizens.
Let's start with bottom-up.
Sure. The bottom-up approach is heavily favored in liberal welfare states, places like the United States, the UK, or Australia. It leans very heavily on the work of political scientist Robert Putnam and his famous concept of social capital.
Oh, I'm familiar with Putnam's work. Social capital is the idea that the health of a society is measured by voluntary civic engagement, right?
Exactly.
It's the bowling leagues, the local PTA meetings, the neighborhood watch groups, the amateur softball teams.
It is the density of voluntary participation. The theory is that trust forms when individuals actively choose to engage with the institutions of civil society outside of their immediate family.
Right.
So in this bottom-up view, cohesion is the glue that citizens manufacture themselves from the ground up through constant low-stakes interaction.
And in that model, the government's job is mostly just to get out of the way, or at best, facilitate the space for that interaction to happen.
Right.
But the top-down approach is a totally different beast. The literature notes this is much more common in European institutions like the Council of Europe. Their definition of social cohesion completely shifts the responsibility.
Yeah, the Council of Europe defines social cohesion as the capacity of a society to ensure welfare, minimize disparities, and avoid polarization. The language there is highly institutional and proactive.
It views cohesion not as a byproduct of people hanging out in bowling alleys, but as the active, state-managed reduction of cleavages between groups.
Yes.
Reducing economic inequality, bridging ethnic divides, providing universal safety nets. It puts the responsibility squarely on the government to establish the macro structures that mandate a cohesive society, often through the heavy redistribution of resources.
And then you have organizations like the World Bank attempting to synthesize all of this into something they can actually measure on a global scale.
How do they even measure that?
Well, they define social cohesion broadly as a sense of shared purpose, trust, and willingness to cooperate. But they break that down into three very specific, measurable directions: bonding, bridging, and linking.
Let's define those because that framework is incredibly useful for the rest of this discussion. So, bonding is horizontal cohesion within a specific homogeneous group.
Right.
It's the intense trust within your immediate family or maybe a very tight-knit religious community. It is strong but exclusive.
Then you have bridging. This is also horizontal cohesion, but it extends across different groups.
Like between neighborhoods.
Exactly. How well do the different neighborhoods in a sprawling city interact with one another? How much trust exists between different socioeconomic classes or ethnic groups within a country?
But the crucial third dimension, and the one that really gets to the heart of our question today, is linking or vertical cohesion. This is the relationship between the people and the state itself.
This is the big one. Do the citizens trust the institutions of power? Do they trust the courts, the police, the tax authorities, the health departments?
And it's an inherently asymmetrical relationship.
Very much so. Because the state possesses a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, which individuals do not. But without that vertical linking trust, the bonding and bridging at the bottom eventually become irrelevant. The whole macrostructure becomes unstable.
I'm trying to visualize these two overarching approaches. Bottom-up creation of social capital versus the top-down state enforcement of cohesion. I have an analogy. Tell me if this tracks.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say you want a strong, tight-knit residential neighborhood. The bottom-up approach is like a neighborhood potluck. Everyone organically decides to show up on a Saturday. Someone brings a casserole, someone brings a salad, someone brings dessert.
Sounds nice.
Right. You sit on the grass, you talk, you form bonds. It is chaotic. It is completely unstructured. Maybe there are 3 different potato salads and no main course. But the community builds itself.
That is a perfect visualization of organic solidarity. The community is generating its own social capital through voluntary, imperfect interaction.
But the top-down approach that feels a bit more like a strict homeowners association.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Yeah. The HOA decides that to maintain community standards, to ensure welfare, and to avoid any visual disparities, every single resident must paint their front door the exact same shade of beige. And they must cut their grass to exactly 2 inches. Now, if you drive through that neighborhood, it looks incredibly uniform. It looks profoundly cohesive from the outside. But is that actual Durkheimian cohesion? Or is that just where the line between community trust and mandatory compliance starts to blur?
That tension is the central axis of the literature we are examining. When a government enforces the beige doors through laws, regulations, and behavioral nudges, are they actually fostering deep, organic trust?
Or just faking it?
Right. Are they just manufacturing a neat, compliant facade that looks good on paper?
Which moves us from the macro level of society down to the individual psychology of the citizen. Because if true, organic cohesion is the voluntary potluck, we have to ask why on earth so many of us so readily follow the rigid rules of the HOA.
It's a great question.
Why do we paint the door beige even if we privately loathe the color? If we want to understand state compliance, we have to look at the raw psychology of conformity.
What's fascinating here is that human beings are fundamentally, biologically wired to seek acceptance. We are social primates. To understand why we comply with state mandates, we have to look at how we comply with social pressure, specifically a phenomenon called normative social influence.
And the foundational text on this is the classic 1955 Solomon Asch conformity experiments. I was rereading the methodology of this study, and I am always struck by how deviously simple, yet incredibly stressful, the setup was for the subjects.
Oh, the brilliance of the Asch experiment lies in its absolute simplicity.
Right.
So imagine you're a participant in a psychology study at a university. You walk into a room and take a seat at a table with 7 or 8 other people who you assume are just fellow participants. The experimenter stands at the front of the room and explains this is just a basic vision test.
Okay. And the experimenter holds up 2 large white cards. On the first card, there is a single, bold, black line. On the second card, there are 3 lines of varying lengths, labeled A, B, and C.
Right.
And your job is simply to look at the cards and state out loud which of the 3 lines matches the length of the single line.
It is not a trick question, and it is not ambiguous. To the naked human eye, the answer is blatantly, undeniably obvious. Line A might be 2 inches, line B might be 5 inches, and line C is clearly the exact match to the original.
It is like asking someone to identify the tallest person in a room when one person is a 7-foot-tall NBA player and everyone else is 5 feet tall. There's 0 cognitive load involved.
Exactly. But the catch, of course, is that everyone else sitting at that table is an actor.
Right.
A confederate working directly for the experimenter. And for the first few rounds of the test, everything proceeds normally. Everyone goes around the table and gives the correct, obvious answer. You feel relaxed.
But
then, on the third trial, the experimenter holds up a new set of cards. The match is, once again, glaringly obvious, but the first actor confidently states a blatantly wrong answer.
And then the second actor gives the exact same wrong answer. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. They all completely agree on a reality that your eyes are telling you is false.
Right.
And then it is your turn to speak. The psychological pressure in that room, the sudden spike of adrenaline must have been overwhelming. You're sitting there trapped between your own basic sensory perception and the unanimous, confident consensus of the group.
And Ash's results were staggering and, frankly, a bit terrifying for anyone who believes in rugged individualism. He found that participants conformed to the blatantly wrong answer given by the group over 36% of the time.
Over a third of the time. Intelligent, rational adults just lied about what was right in front of their faces.
Yeah.
And the crucial piece of context here is that when Ash ran a control group, where participants were allowed to write their answers down privately on a piece of paper, they were correct over 99% of the time.
Right. They weren't hallucinating. They knew the truth.
So they chose to lie.
That discrepancy is the core finding of normative social influence. People engage in what psychologists call public compliance without private acceptance.
Wow. Public compliance without private acceptance.
They conform outwardly to avoid the disapproval of the group, to avoid being the odd one out, while internally maintaining their original belief. Follow-up interviews with the subjects revealed they didn't suddenly believe the wrong line was correct. They simply couldn't bear the social friction, the sheer awkwardness of publicly disagreeing with a unanimous majority.
That is just wild. And the literature we have points out how this normative influence dictates massive swaths of our everyday lives. We conform to unwritten rules about fashion trends, workplace jargon, or the pursuit of ideal body types.
Absolutely.
We participate in these behaviors not necessarily because we privately agree with them or enjoy them, but because the human fear of social exclusion is so incredibly powerful.
Well, from an evolutionary standpoint, it is a survival mechanism. In our ancient hunter-gatherer past, being ostracized and excluded from the tribe essentially meant a death sentence. You could not survive alone in the wilderness.
So, conforming to group norms creates a very stable, cohesive tribe.
Right. But the unintended modern consequence is that it heavily reduces individualism and critical dissent.
Okay, so that establishes the psychological baseline. We are wired to avoid social friction. But how does that psychological quirk translate to legal compliance? How does a government, which cannot put a police officer on every single corner, harness that innate fear of standing out?
Well, the sources point to a really interesting study on Scottish traffic laws that perfectly illustrates this transition from psychology to jurisprudence.
Oh, the Scottish traffic study. Yeah, this is a phenomenal bridge between behavioral psychology and law enforcement. It basically sets out to answer a very simple question. Why do people obey traffic laws when nobody is watching?
Exactly. Like, why do you stop at a red light at 3 a.m. on an empty street when there are absolutely no police around?
Right. If we look at this through the lens of pure traditional economics, where humans are perfectly rational actors maximizing their own utility, you should just run the red light.
Right. The risk of punishment is zero, the cost of waiting is high, so running it is the logical choice.
Yet the vast majority of people still stop and wait for the green light. The researchers in Scotland found that instrumental concerns, meaning the direct fear of the sanction, the fear of getting a financial ticket, only play a surprisingly small role in overall compliance.
It's true. The much stronger, far more robust predictor of compliance is a concept called procedural justice, and how that justice ties directly into our social identity.
I want to break down procedural justice because it seems to be the linchpin of vertical cohesion.
Yeah, procedural justice refers to the perceived fairness of the processes and interactions used by authorities. It is not just about the outcome, it is about the interaction itself.
Like how a cop talks to you.
Exactly. When a police officer stops you, do they treat you with neutrality? Are they transparent about why they stopped you? And most importantly, do they treat you with basic respect and human dignity? The Scottish study demonstrated that when the police treat citizens fairly, it actually strengthens the citizen's psychological identification with the superordinate group.
And in this specific study, the superordinate group being upstanding Scottish citizens.
Right. The authority figure, the police officer, the judge, the tax auditor, serves as the physical representative of the state. If they treat you with respect, they are essentially signaling to you, hey, you are a valued, respected member of this group.
And because we're wired to seek acceptance.
Yes, as a human being wired to seek acceptance, you internalize that identity. You follow the rules not because you are terrified of a ticket, but because you want to demonstrate and reproduce your membership in a group that has validated you. You obey the traffic laws at 3 a.m. because that is simply what a good Scottish citizen does.
The external threat of the law transforms into an internal component of your own identity, which, I mean, from the perspective of a policymaker, sounds like the absolute holy grail. That sounds like the ultimate, most efficient goal for any government trying to maintain order.
It is the ideal scenario, but it presents a massive, incredibly delicate regulatory dilemma. And this brings us to the work of legal scholar Yuval Feldman in his research on effective voluntary compliance.
Okay, what did he find?
Feldman highlights the central, agonizing tension every regulator faces. Do you design your systems around a command and control approach or a trust-based approach?
Command control being the traditional model of heavy monitoring, strict rules, and severe sanctions.
Yeah.
The big stick approach.
Exactly. And Feldman acknowledges that command and control can guarantee very high immediate compliance. If you install a highly visible speed camera on every single street corner and automatically find anyone going 1 mile over the limit, people will absolutely stop speeding. But Feldman points out the hidden long-term cost. Heavy-handed monitoring actively crowds out trustworthiness and intrinsic motivation.
Oh, it reminds me of the studies they do on education and motivation. If you tell a child you're going to pay them $5 for every book they read, they might read a dozen books that month.
Right.
But you have fundamentally destroyed their intrinsic love of reading. You have turned a joyful activity into a transactional labor. The exact moment you stop paying them, they will never pick up a book again.
That is the exact mechanism at play in civic compliance. When a state relies purely on intense monitoring and punishment, it signals to the citizens that the state does not trust them to do the right thing voluntarily. And because the state does not trust them, the citizens no longer feel any moral obligation to act like trustworthy group members.
So the psychological contract of procedural justice is broken?
Exactly. But on the flip side of Feldman's dilemma, if the government relies entirely on trust-based regulation using gentle nudges, public pledges, or appeals to civic morality, they risk catastrophic rates of non-compliance if the underlying social norms are not already strong enough.
Yeah, let me ask you, then let me pose this directly to you listening as well. Have you ever just nodded along with a group because it was vastly easier than arguing?
Oh, all the time.
Have you ever sat at a dinner party and enthusiastically agreed that a movie was brilliant because all your friends loved it, even though you secretly found it incredibly boring? We have all done it. We all perform public compliance without private acceptance. And this is exactly what I want to push back on regarding state policy.
Okay, lay it on me.
If we were biologically wired to publicly comply just to fit in, like we saw vividly in the Ash experiment, how can a government ever accurately measure true social cohesion? Aren't they essentially just measuring our fear of standing out?
That is the paradox at the heart of measuring societal health. I mean, if a state observer walks down our hypothetical street and sees that every single resident has painted their door beige, they can record a 100% compliance rate. The spreadsheet looks perfect, but that metric is entirely hollow. The observer has absolutely no way to determine if those residents painted their doors out of a shared, joyful commitment to the neighborhood aesthetic or out of a desperate, grinding fear of being heavily fined by the HOA or socially ostracized by their neighbors.
The outward measurable behavior is identical, but the internal psychological reality is completely bifurcated.
And if we want to truly test this theory to see how group identity, state coercion, and compliance interact in the real world, we have to look at the most universal and frequently the most painful metric of state cooperation.
We have to talk about taxes.
We have to look at taxation. Because we have to ask, is parting with your hard-earned money an act of true Durkheimian social cohesion? Or is it just the ultimate form of state-mandated compliance?
Yeah, and to understand this, I was looking at a concept in the literature called the horizontal fiscal contract. And this framework really shifted my perspective because we usually conceptualize taxes as a strictly vertical relationship. It is me, the individual, begrudgingly handing my money over to a massive, faceless government entity.
Right, that's how most people feel.
But the economic sociologists argue that taxation is actually a massive, complex, collective action problem between citizens.
That vertical view is incomplete. For a tax system to function efficiently without requiring a heavily armed police officer at every doorstep, the citizens must possess high levels of moralistic trust in each other.
In each other, not just the state.
Yes. They have to believe that if they put a percentage of their labor into the communal pot, their fellow citizens are doing the exact same thing, and that the shared wealth will be utilized to benefit the common good.
Because, if I genuinely believe that my neighbor is exploiting loopholes and dodging his taxes, and the wealthy elites are hiding their money in offshore accounts, I'm going to feel like an absolute sucker for paying my fair share. My willingness to comply plummets.
Exactly. The horizontal fiscal contract dictates that successful taxation requires a shared national identity and a fundamental belief that the system is legitimate and is actively working to minimize absolute poverty. If those foundational elements of social cohesion are present, people are far more willing to comply voluntarily, even when it hurts financially.
But even in a highly cohesive, high-trust society, handing over a third of your income hurts.
Oh, always.
And this is where the behavioral economics paper by Savitha S. on tax compliance really illuminates the mechanics of evasion. Because traditional economics, again, assumes we are all hyper-rational actors making perfectly logical risk-reward calculations. Behavioral economics looks at actual human behavior and says, no, we are deeply irrational, highly emotional creatures prone to a massive array of cognitive biases.
The Savitha S. paper provides a brilliant taxonomy of the psychological barriers to tax compliance. It argues that a vast amount of noncompliance isn't malicious evasion, but rather the result of cognitive friction.
Right.
The first major barrier is complexity aversion. Tax codes globally are notoriously, sometimes punishingly, intricate. When an individual is faced with multiple forms, contradictory rules, and dense legal jargon, they experience severe cognitive overload. They make errors, or they simply avoid the task entirely because it is too mentally exhausting to process.
I can completely relate to that. The sheer act of staring at the forms and trying to decipher the terminology makes me want to close my laptop and take a nap. It is a very real psychological wall. What are the other biases they identified?
Another critical one is the availability heuristic.
Yeah.
Human beings tend to base their judgments on information that is readily available and comes easily to mind. So, if the media is constantly running front-page stories about massive tax evasion scandals by multinational corporations or billionaires, the average citizen begins to perceive that systemic noncompliance is the normal state of affairs. This readily available narrative justifies their own low-level avoidance.
The internal logic becomes, well, if the billionaires aren't paying, the system is already rigged, so why should I meticulously report my side hustle income?
Exactly. Furthermore, you have overconfidence bias, where taxpayers wildly overestimate their ability to navigate complex rules without professional help, leading to a cascade of careless errors.
Right.
And finally, perhaps the most powerful driver is loss aversion.
Loss aversion is fascinating. It's the psychological principle that the pain of losing $50 feels significantly worse, much more intense, than the joy of finding $50 on the street.
We are wired to protect what we already have. The immediate, highly tangible psychological pain of paying a large tax bill today completely overwhelms the abstract, diffuse, long-term benefit of enjoying better paved roads or a stronger public school system 5 years from now.
Okay, so if we accept that we are cognitively biased against paying taxes, how do modern governments actually combat this? The literature provides two very distinct real-world case studies from India, showing how the state intervenes using these exact behavioral insights to boost compliance.
Yes. The first major case study is India's implementation of the Goods and Services Tax, or GST, which rolled out in 2017. It was a massive, unprecedented systemic overhaul designed to replace a chaotic web of multiple indirect taxes with a single, unified structure.
And to combat the issue of complexity aversion, the government focused heavily on systemic simplification and architectural nudging. Right.
Exactly. They built a single, centralized online portal to drastically reduce the cognitive overload of filing across different jurisdictions. But the most interesting part of this was the introduction of a feature called automatic invoice matching.
How did that work under the hood?
It is a brilliant example of systemic nudging. The digital architecture of the GST system was designed to automatically compare the invoices submitted by the sellers with the invoices reported by the buyers. It created a highly transparent digital environment where any discrepancies or missing information were instantly flagged by the system.
Wow.
It didn't require an aggressive auditor to knock on a door. The architecture of the system itself gently but firmly nudged businesses toward accurate reporting because the risk of being caught in an error was suddenly highly visible and automated. Coupled with regular automated SMS reminders about filing deadlines, it significantly reduced passive non-compliance.
So that is an example of designing a frictionless digital system to make compliance the path of least resistance. But the second case study, focusing on India's income tax interventions, takes a much more direct psychological route into the minds of the citizens.
Yeah, this is where we see the state actively utilizing social norms and cognitive framing to directly influence behavior. The Indian Income Tax Department altered their communication strategy. Instead of sending out the traditional, terrifying letters threatening severe audits and financial penalties, they began sending highly targeted letters utilizing social norm messaging.
Social norm messaging.
Yeah, they would inform a specific taxpayer, for example, that the vast majority of taxpayers in your specific income bracket and your specific zip code have already filed correctly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The government is explicitly telling people, look around you. Everyone else in your peer group is already doing this.
They also deployed positive framing. Instead of framing the tax payment strictly as a punitive financial obligation to the state, the new communications heavily emphasized that paying taxes was a direct, noble contribution to national development, infrastructure, and societal welfare. They actively tried to reframe the psychological pain of loss aversion into the pride of civic duty and group membership.
Let me stop you right there. Because telling a citizen, most people in your peer group have already paid, is the exact same psychological mechanism we just talked about in the Solomon Asch conformity experiment.
It really is.
You are deliberately leveraging the individual's deep-seated evolutionary fear of being outside the normative group. So I have to challenge this premise. If a government successfully nudges a population into paying higher taxes through highly orchestrated, data-driven social pressure, does that actually build a cohesive society? Or has the government simply figured out how to effectively hack human psychology to boost their quarterly revenue?
That is the most profound and perhaps cynical critique of behavioral public policy and nudge theory. Are we actually creating citizens who deeply philosophically believe in the horizontal fiscal contract? Or are we just designing a vastly more efficient, frictionless compliance machine?
Right.
If my compliance is achieved merely because a cleverly worded algorithm triggered my evolutionary fear of being ostracized by my neighbors, it does not necessarily indicate that I have any true underlying trust in the state's institutions. It just indicates that the psychological nudge worked exactly as designed.
And if using behavioral nudges to get people to pay taxes is the relatively benign, helpful side of state influence because, let's face it, we do need tax revenue to run a functioning society. What happens when governments utilize the powerful rhetoric of social cohesion in a much more heavy-handed, coercive manner?
When that happens, we enter much darker, far more controversial territory. We start seeing the concept of cohesion used not as a noble goal of mutual trust, but as a rhetorical weapon for social control and the suppression of dissent.
Now, we are going to look at how this plays out in highly charged political spaces, specifically recent protests and legislative responses in Australia. And I want to reiterate our framework here.
Yes, very important.
Our goal is absolutely not to take a stance on the underlying geopolitical conflicts or the morality of the protests themselves. We are looking purely at the mechanics of how the language of social cohesion is being deployed in real time by politicians and how civil liberties advocates are deconstructing that language. We are analyzing the arguments, not endorsing them.
A vital clarification. The specific literature we are examining from Australia focuses heavily on the political aftermath of a tragic event, the Bondi stabbing tragedy, and how leaders across the political spectrum reacted to the subsequent societal tension.
Following that event, the sources, which include analyses from the Avert Research Network, submissions to the New South Wales Parliament, and arguments published in the UTS Vertigo magazine, highlight a fascinating rhetorical shift. Politicians rapidly, almost uniformly, invoke the urgent need to protect social cohesion.
Right.
And in the name of preserving that cohesion, they pushed to pass very strong hate crime legislation, which specifically included banning certain phrases and slogans frequently used in political protests regarding the Middle East, such as from the river to the sea or calls to globalize the Intifada.
And the arguments against this rapid legislative push offer a fierce structural critique of how the state defines and enforces cohesion. The civil liberties advocates and academic researchers argue that the state's approach is fundamentally flawed.
How do they deconstruct the government's argument?
Their primary argument is that the government is treating social non-cohesion, the protests, the friction, the public anger as the root cause of societal instability. The state views the non-cohesion as a virus introduced by bad actors that needs to be eradicated.
Okay.
But the authors argue that non-cohesion is merely a symptom. They argue that widespread protests and political friction do not just materialize out of thin air. They are born from deep underlying material conditions and unresolved political grievances.
Right. The UTS Vertigo piece makes this point very aggressively. They argue that you cannot separate the protests from the broader context of unaffordable housing, crippling cost-of-living crises, inflation, and intense legitimate political disagreements regarding foreign policy and human rights.
Consequently, the NSW Parliament submission explicitly argues that by banning specific protest slogans, the government is simply trying to silence the symptom without treating the underlying disease. They frame this legislation as the direct repression of legitimate political speech and democratic dissent, disguised as a public safety measure.
The advocates claim that when the state demands social cohesion in this context, what they are actually demanding is the unbroken continuation of the status quo. The submission calls it a naive and highly dangerous fantasy of a nation without political and social conflict.
And if we look for parallels in the literature, we see this exact same rhetorical strategy used in completely different socioeconomic contexts. The source material provides a striking comparative example from the United Kingdom regarding the treatment of homelessness.
Oh, I was fascinated by this parallel. How does the rhetoric of social cohesion get applied to the issue of street homelessness?
Well, a detailed public policy paper by Fitzpatrick and Jones traces a distinct historical shift in UK policy regarding rough sleeping. Initially, in the late 20th century, street homelessness was viewed primarily through the sociological lens of social exclusion.
Social exclusion.
Yes. The framework was that these individuals had fallen out of the societal structure, and the government's role was to provide housing, addiction services, and mental health support to pull them back into the fold of society.
The goal was to build them back into the community,
Yeah.
to foster actual bridging and linking cohesion.
Exactly. But over the ensuing decades, the rhetoric subtly but powerfully shifted. Street homelessness became increasingly framed by politicians not as an exclusion issue requiring support, but as an antisocial behavior issue that actively threatened community cohesion. The presence of unhoused people was framed as a disruption to the peaceful, cohesive experience of the average taxpayer. And because it was now categorized as a threat to cohesion, the policy response became significantly more punitive and coercive.
So the objective shifted from providing comprehensive social services to simply utilizing law enforcement to move the homeless individuals out of sight. They were moved out of the commercial city centers and off the main streets, effectively hiding the problem to maintain the visual appearance of a neat, cohesive, functioning community.
Fitzpatrick and Jones described this transition perfectly. They called it a move to a social control perspective, using the rhetoric of social cohesion. The beautiful, unifying language of cohesion was weaponized to justify the coercion and marginalization of a vulnerable group.
It makes me think of a very specific analogy. It is like a homeowner tending to a lawn. If a government views its society as a pristine, perfectly manicured, homogeneous green lawn, then political protests, loud dissent, or visible street homelessness look like weeds disrupting the pattern.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
Does pulling out those weeds make the garden look neat, uniform, and perfectly compliant? Yes, absolutely. But does violently ripping out a weed actually address the underlying health of the soil? Does it fix the lack of nutrients or the drought? No. It just makes the lawn look presentable for the neighbors driving by.
Right.
And I have to wonder, looking at the history of social progress, does true democracy actually require non-cohesion and friction to function? Can a democratic society survive, let alone progress, if it is perfectly silently compliant?
If you look at the historical record, the answer is definitively no. Every major leap forward in democratic progress, whether it was women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, or the establishment of basic labor protections, required immense, deeply uncomfortable social friction. It required prolonged periods of intense non-cohesion to shatter the existing unjust status quo. A perfectly compliant society is a stagnant society.
So if we establish that progress requires friction, what happens when a state prioritizes quiet compliance over true, organic, messy cohesion? How does the public actually react when the pressure builds? The literature provides a stark, empirically robust example of public rebellion during a massive crisis. I want to dive into the sociological study of the Polish COVID-19 clusters.
This study by Wróblewski and his colleagues is an absolute goldmine of data on how trust dictates behavior. They conducted a massive sociological analysis of the attitudes and behaviors of Polish citizens during the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020.
And the context here is key.
Absolutely. The absolutely vital context required to understand this data is that Poland, historically and culturally, possesses very low baseline trust in government institutions and very low trust in official medical expertise, even long before the pandemic began.
So the vertical cohesion, that vital linking trust between the average citizen and the state apparatus, was already severely damaged, if not entirely broken, before the virus even arrived.
Yes. The researchers wanted to measure exactly how that pre-existing lack of trust fractured the society when it was subjected to the extreme stress test of a global health crisis. They used advanced cluster analysis to divide the population into 5 distinct psychographic groups based on their responses to the pandemic. 3 of these clusters are incredibly revealing for our discussion on compliance.
Let's break those down. The first major group they identified is categorized as the dissenters, making up roughly 17% of the Polish population. How did this group view the reality of the pandemic?
The dissenters were characterized by profound skepticism regarding the actual physical threat posed by the virus. They widely believed that the government was intentionally exaggerating the danger to exert control, and they firmly believed that the official death toll statistics were wildly overestimated or entirely fabricated.
And who were they, demographically?
Demographically, the data showed they were largely wealthier, lived predominantly in rural or suburban areas rather than dense city centers, and were highly economically active. This cluster contained a high percentage of self-employed individuals and small business owners.
So if they didn't view it as a health crisis, how did they process the reality of lockdowns and mandates?
They processed it almost exclusively through the lens of economic interference and state overreach. Because they tended to be slightly younger and wealthier with better access to private health care, they did not perceive the virus as a severe personal health threat. However, they viewed the government's mandatory restrictions as a direct, catastrophic threat to their economic livelihood.
Ah, I see.
Their total lack of linking trust in the state allowed them to essentially reject the state's empirical reality regarding the virus.
They opted out of the shared reality.
Yeah.
But the dissenters weren't the only group operating with a severe lack of trust, and this is where the cluster analysis gets incredibly nuanced and fascinating.
Yeah, look at the data for the next 2 groups. The critical conformists, who made up about 19% of the population, and the government's critics, who comprised another 17%. Combined, that is 36% of the country.
How did their worldview differ from the wealthy, rural dissenters?
Completely opposite in their perception of the virus. Unlike the dissenters, both the critical conformists and the critics did believe the virus was a massive existential threat to public health.
Okay.
They strongly supported the implementation of severe restrictions, they advocated for mask mandates, and they supported school and business closures. They recognized the biological danger.
But despite agreeing on the restrictions, they also completely distrusted the government.
Entirely. But their distrust manifested in the exact opposite direction of the dissenters. The critical conformists and the critics believed the Polish state was actually downplaying the severity of the threat. They believed the official death toll statistics were wildly underestimated because they viewed the government administration as fundamentally incompetent and believed the national healthcare system was totally unprepared to handle the surge.
This raises an important question. If you have a society where everyone is living in the exact same country, experiencing the exact same pandemic, and looking at the exact same public health data, but they are drawing totally opposite, fiercely held conclusions about reality, what does that mean for the fundamental stability of that society?
It demonstrates, with hard data, that true societal compliance cannot simply be mandated from the top down during a crisis. The Polish case study proves that when vertical cohesion, that foundational linking trust in institutions, in the accuracy of public statistics, in the basic competence of the state is broken, a society instantly fractures into different mutually exclusive realities. You cannot legislate a shared reality if the trust doesn't exist.
Think back to the World Bank's definition of cohesion we discussed at the very beginning. They defined it as trust and willingness to cooperate. In the Polish example, you have 36% of the population, the critical conformists and the critics, who are totally willing to cooperate with the rules. They are wearing the masks, they are staying home, they're isolating.
Right.
But they have absolutely zero trust in the rule makers. They are complying out of sheer self-preservation, but they are entirely cynical about the government's motives and competence. I have to ask, is that a sustainable model for a society? Or is that just a ticking time bomb waiting for the next crisis?
Sociologically, it is highly unsustainable. When compliance is driven purely by the fear of an external threat, whether that threat is a deadly virus, the heavy hand of the police, or the fear of social ostracization rather than a deep-seated trust in the institutions managing the threat, the social contract becomes incredibly brittle.
It just shatters.
The moment the immediate threat passes, or the moment the government requires cooperation on a new, unrelated issue, that fragile, fear-based compliance will shatter. You cannot build long-term stability on a foundation of cynicism.
So, what does this all mean? We have covered immense complex ground today, tracing this concept from 19th century Paris to modern behavioral economics.
If we synthesize all the literature and data we've explored, a very clear, if somewhat sobering, picture emerges. Social cohesion in its purest original Durkheimian form is about organic solidarity. It is the messy, spontaneous, grassroots trust and shared purpose that develops only because we realize we fundamentally need each other to survive and thrive.
It is the chaotic, wonderful neighborhood potluck where everyone brings something to the table.
But when this beautiful organic concept is filtered through the machinery of state policy and bureaucracy, it almost inevitably morphs into a top-down demand for compliance. Governments have an immediate pressing mandate to maintain public order, collect massive amounts of revenue, and manage fast-moving crises. True, organic cohesion takes generations of careful tending to build, and it requires addressing deep, complex material inequalities. Compliance, on the other hand, can be achieved much faster through regulation and behavioral science.
And we explored exactly how they achieve it. They use clever behavioral nudges, leveraging our fear of missing out to collect taxes more efficiently. They employ the psychological tricks of procedural justice to make us internalize traffic laws so they don't have to hire more police.
Exactly.
They pass controversial, rapid-fire legislation to ban uncomfortable political slogans and utilize the rhetoric of unity to sweep visible homelessness out of the public square. Governments frequently seek the appearance of unity. They want the perfectly manicured lawn and the neighborhood of identical beige doors, rather than doing the difficult, expensive, long-term work of building actual community trust and addressing the root causes of friction.
And as the Polish COVID-19 study vividly demonstrated, when a state demands total compliance without first fostering vertical trust, you end up with a society that is fundamentally fractured and deeply cynical, even if, on paper, everyone appears to be following the rules.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this exploration. As we look to the near future, artificial intelligence and omnipresent algorithmic monitoring are becoming increasingly inextricably integrated into law enforcement, tax collection, and the distribution of social services.
It's happening fast.
We are rapidly approaching a technological reality where governments will possess the ultimate, frictionless tools to enforce absolute compliance. A high-definition camera on every single corner, an algorithm instantly matching and auditing every digital transaction you make, predictive policing models identifying friction before it happens.
We are building an architecture where behavioral non-compliance is almost mathematically impossible.
But if a society is forced to perfectly, silently obey every single rule by an invisible, omnipresent digital architecture, will we have finally achieved the ultimate utopian state of social cohesion? Or will we have permanently destroyed the very concept of voluntary human trust? Because if you no longer have the freedom to choose to do the wrong thing, does doing the right thing mean anything at all?
A profound and terrifying question for the next decade of public policy.
It makes you wonder, the next time you hear a politician on the news telling you that we just need a little more social cohesion, take a good, hard look at the policies they're proposing. Look at the structural intent and ask yourself whether they are inviting you to a neighborhood potluck or if they are just handing you a bucket of beige paint and telling you to get in line.